Welcome to the University of Michigan Dentistry Podcast Series, promoting oral health care worldwide.
The purpose of this presentation is to demonstrate to you a clinical technique for use in taking alginate impressions of dental arches. Now, an alginate impression is an imprint of the teeth and alveolar process made in a material called alginate, shown here. Alginate impressions are used in the preparation of plaster models of teeth. Plaster models of dental arches are used in nearly every phase of dentistry. Specifically, this presentation will demonstrate to you an alginate impression technique that can be used to produce orthodontic study models, as shown here. The materials and instruments that are used in taking alginate impressions are as follows. A set of impression trays of various sizes, maxillary and mandibular, from small ranging to large sizes. Some red rope wax that is used to extend the length of the flange of the tray. Some pink baseplate wax that's used to take a wax bite occlusal registration. The alginate itself comes in pre-measured envelopes or in bulk form. It is in powder as it comes in these two packages. A green rubber bowl is used to mix the alginate, and the brown-handled spatula with the thick blade, stiff blade, is used. This graduated cylinder is used to measure the water that's mixed with the alginate powder. To prepare your patient for the taking of alginate impressions, you adjust the chair to the fully upright position. You adjust the headrest so that the eye-ear plane of the patient is parallel to the floor. You should visually inspect the patient's mouth before impressions are taken to be sure that it's free of any food debris or foreign matter. Also, it's usually best to have the patient rinse their mouth before impressions are taken to be sure that the mouth is clear of any thick saliva that might be present. The impression trays are selected by what might be called a trial and error method. You look in the patient's mouth and get an estimate of the size of the dental arch, and then choose a tray and try it in until you find the right one. There are certain criteria that you'll want to follow in selecting these trays. For the maxillary dental arch, the tray must be large enough to cover all the teeth and the maxillary tuberosity completely. Also, the tray must cover the anterior teeth such that the incisal edges of the incisors would rest over the flat arch form portion of the tray approximately 2/3 of the way towards the raised palatal portion of the tray. The maxillary tray also must be wide enough to be at least 4 millimeters wider than the most apical portion of the molar region alveolar process. For the mandibular arch, you should select a tray that will cover all of the teeth and the retromolar pad area completely. The teeth must be centered labiolingually in the tray. It is sometimes necessary to extend the length of the flanges of these trays in order that the alginate in the tray is supported in all of its peripheries. This is done with red rope wax that's molded into place like this. It's usually always necessary to add red rope wax in the anterior flange area of the tray to be sure that the alginate is carried to the depth of the anterior labial vestibule. Now, before you take the impressions of the patients, it is a good idea to rehearse the movements that you're going to make with the trays. Your rehearsal of these movements might go as follows. Now, I'm going to try this into your mouth. When we actually take the impressions, there'll be some white, soft stuff in here. Let's just try it in. Put your tongue up on the roof of your mouth when it's in there. That's it. Now I want you to breathe through your mouth. Slow, deep breaths while that tray is in your mouth. Okay? Let's take it out now. The upper one will be the same way. We're going to have some soft stuff in there. Let's try it in. Just lean your head forward a bit more. That's it. Now open up. That's it. Fine. Now, when this one is in there, I want you to lean your head forward, quite a ways forward. That's it. And breathe right through your mouth. Take nice deep breaths right through your mouth. Okay. Now we're going to take the lower impression first. Okay. The alginate is prepared after the impression trays are all set to go. 3 scoops of alginate powder from the can are placed into the rubber bowl. The pre-measured envelopes of alginate also contain a 3-scoop mix of powder. This plastic graduated cylinder is used to measure the water needed to mix the alginate. Lines on the cylinder indicate the amount of water needed for 1, 2, or 3 scoops of alginate powder. The 3-scoop mixes from the envelopes should be mixed with 1 to 2 millimeters less water than the graduated cylinder indicates to achieve the correct consistency. The 3-scoop mixes from a can should be mixed with the full measure of water. Room temperature water should be used for the alginate mix. To mix the alginate, the water is combined with the powder. The material is spatulated against the sides of the rubber bowl. As you spatulate this, you want to drive off the air bubbles that might be incorporated in the mix. You usually spatulate for 30 to 45 seconds. You want to achieve a smooth and homogeneous mixture. When you're satisfied with the mixture, you gather it into one unit and load the tray. To load the tray, you force the material firmly down into the tray. You want to be sure that you don't incorporate any voids or bubbles in the tray while you're loading it. To take the impression, you stand in front of the patient. You slowly rotate the tray into the mouth. With your free hand, you get a hold of the lower lip. You seat the posterior area of the tray first. Then, being sure that you have the teeth centered in the tray, you seat the anterior aspect of the tray. Slowly. Take your time in this procedure. You seat the tray until only 1 to 2 millimeters of alginate would separate the incisal edges of the teeth from the tray metal. You hold the tray in place until the alginate sets. The alginate is firm now. The tray is removed with a quick snap movement and gently moved out of the mouth. Now, after you remove the tray, you attend to your patient. The impression is washed with water and then wrapped in a wet paper towel. The maxillary tray has been loaded with alginate and is all set to go. To take the maxillary impression, you stand behind the patient. Slowly rotate the tray into the patient's mouth. Lean your head forward a little bit more. That's it. Hold the upper lip up with your free hand. Slowly seat the posterior part of the tray. Then rotate the tray up into place. You seat the tray. Lean forward now. Lean forward. Breathe through your mouth. That's good. You seat the tray until only 1 to 2 millimeters of alginate would separate the incisal edges of the teeth from the tray metal. You hold this impression in place until the alginate becomes firm. The alginate is set up. The impression is removed with a quick movement, snapping movement, to release it from the teeth. And again, you attend to your patient. The impression is washed with water and wrapped in a wet paper towel. A wax bite in centric occlusion is taken as a guide to articulating the models of the teeth that you're going to make. The wax bite is taken with a small piece of pink base plate wax. This wax is heated in warm water until it becomes soft. The wax is placed on the occlusal surfaces of the maxillary teeth such that it ends just lingual to the maxillary incisors. Now slowly close your teeth together, real slowly. That's it. Bite right down into it. That's it. Bite down hard now and hold it. Very good. Now open up, please. It is a good idea to write the patient's initials in the tongue space of the wax bite for identification. An adequate set of alginate impressions should have the following characteristics. First, it must have proper extension so that it records all of the erupted teeth in both the upper and the lower dental arches. Also, the impressions must record the alveolar process in its entirety. For the lower arch, this means distal to the third molar, the retromolar pad area. For the maxillary impression, it means the entire maxillary tuberosity to the hamular notch area. The labial alveolar bone contour must be recorded in the impression to the greatest depth that the extension of the lip and cheek musculature will allow. This portion of the impression is called the labial roll. Besides being properly extended, an impression must be a truly accurate representation of the tissues. That is, the alginate must be free of voids or bubbles. This area right here is a small void. Voids are caused by improper seating of the impression in the mouth. Bubbles, as shown here, are caused by improper mixing of the alginate in the rubber bowl. The alginate in the tray must be supported in all of its extensions, either by tray metal or by wax extension. This part of this lower impression is not firmly supported by the metal tray, and you can see that it would distort when plaster is poured into it. In conclusion, let me just say that most dentists work with alginate impressions nearly every day in their practices, so it's important that you learn this technique well. We hope that this presentation has given you the basic information that you're going to need in alginate impression technique. The purpose of this presentation is to demonstrate to you the process of pouring plaster and stone into alginate impressions. The procedure to be shown here is specifically designed to transform alginate impressions into orthodontic study model plaster casts. We see here on the table the instruments and materials that are needed for pouring impressions. A graduated cylinder water measure, a scale to measure the powder weight, model base formers, a green-handled spatula for mixing the plaster, a number 7 wax spatula, green rubber bowl, a plaster vibrating machine, and lastly, cast, stone, and snow white plaster. The first step in pouring alginate impressions is to trim off the excess alginate. That is, the alginate that is unsupported by the tray metal or the waxed extensions of the flange. This is done with a lab knife. These extensions of unsupported alginate are removed so that the impression will not be distorted when the plaster is poured into it. The teeth and alveolar process portion of the casts are poured in cast stone. The base portion of these casts are poured in snow white plaster. The cast stone is used to pour the anatomic portion because it is hard and it will resist breakage of the teeth as the models are articulated together. The snow white plaster is used for the base portion because it is soft and easily trimmed in the model trimmer. A mix of cast stone is prepared first. A ratio of 30 cc's of water to 100 grams of powder is used to mix cast stone. It usually takes 200 grams of cast stone powder and 60 cc's of water to pour the upper and the lower impressions together. For this exercise, you're going to measure out the exact amount in grams of powder, cast stone powder, to be used. The use of this scale is as follows. An empty rubber bowl is set on the scale. This numbered dial is adjusted to 0. The cast stone powder in the amount that you want, 200 grams, is added to the bowl, as we've done here, and you have the correct amount then. A graduated cylinder, shown here, is used to measure out the 60 cc's of water. The powder and liquid are combined, and you spatulate with the green-handled spatula. Be sure that the powder is wetted by the water completely. You want to mix this until you reach a smooth and homogeneous material. When all the powder has been incorporated and it's fairly smooth, you then vibrate this. The purpose of vibration is to remove the air bubbles from the mix. You hold the bowl firmly down on the top of this vibrator until almost all of the bubbles have stopped coming out of the mix. After you've been satisfied that most of the air bubbles are gone, you can start to pour your impression. We're going to pour the lower impression first. The impression itself is set on top of the vibrator. The number 7 spatula is used. You slowly add the cast stone in one end of the dental arch of the impression. You flow this cast stone slowly around the dental arch so that it goes into all the little indentations in the impression material. Some of the water that you use to rinse the impression out after you removed it from the mouth will be pushed ahead of this stone as it moves around the dental arch. Let the water flow out the end of the impression, as shown here. After the tooth portion of the impression is filled, you can use the spatula to complete the addition of cast stone to the impression. For this part, it is best to remove the impression from the vibrator so that the stone that you're adding will not run all over the place on the outside of the impression itself. When you have the lower impression completely filled, you set it aside and pour the upper impression in the same manner, flowing stone around the dental arch, pushing the water out, and overfilling the impression with stone. The upper and lower impressions have been poured. The snow white plaster for the bases is now mixed. The snow white plaster is mixed in a ratio of 50 cc's of water to 100 grams of powder. We have prepared here a 250 gram mix of snow white plaster. This amount is needed to pour one model base former. 125 cc's of water has also been measured out. The same procedure is followed for mixing the snow white plaster. Water is added to the powder, and you spatulate slowly at first to wet all the powder completely. You should mix this such that there will be no lumps in the plaster when you end up with your final result ready to pour into the base former. You want a smooth and homogeneous mixture. After you have it mixed sufficiently to remove all the lumps from the mixture, you vibrate it again to remove the bubbles. You can see the bubbles rising to the top of this plaster as you push the bowl firmly down onto the vibrator. You hold the bowl on the vibrator until you're satisfied that most of the bubbles have been removed from the mix. The base former is set on top of the vibrator, and the snow white plaster is poured directly from the bowl into the base former. Do this slowly because the bubbles will rise to the surface of the plaster that's already in the base former when you're pouring it in. After you have the base former filled completely, the lower impression is then placed on the filled model base former. You gently position the filled lower impression such that the dental arch is centered on the plaster base former. You want to be sure also that the occlusal plane, or the top of this impression tray, is fairly parallel to the base of the model base former. Plaster should be added in the heel area of the lower filled impression to be sure that a good seal is formed between the snow white plaster base and the cast stone anatomic portion. You allow this to sit undisturbed until the plaster is hard. The plaster has been allowed to harden. We now can remove the impression from the plaster cast. This is done by slowly lifting up on the handle of the impression tray. It is sometimes necessary to take a plaster knife and release some plaster projections that might have flowed up over the outside of the tray and that might be locking it in place. It's best to be sure that the tray is completely free before you pull it up off the cast. After the impression is removed, you can remove the base former by pushing down on these little tab edges. You break the rubber base former away from the model, and there you have an anatomic representation of the mouth ready for model trimming. Well-poured casts will have the following characteristics. First, they will be free of any voids or bubbles. Second, the union between the cast stone and the snow white plaster will be continuous and will be free from any defects or voids. Third, the anatomic portion of the impression will be centered on the snow white plaster base to allow you sufficient plaster on all sides for model trimming. Lastly, the occlusal planes of both the upper and the lower casts will be parallel to the base of the snow white plaster base.
You've been listening to a presentation from the University of Michigan School of Dentistry, which is dedicated to supporting open learning and open educational resources. This recording is licensed under the Creative Commons. It may be reused and redistributed for nonprofit use. Please attribute materials to the University of Michigan School of Dentistry and redistribute under this same license. For more information on how this and other University of Michigan School of Dentistry recordings may be used, visit www.dent.umich.edu/license.